Hi everyone, thank you Agnes for the very kind introduction, and I'm really happy to be here in Leiden. I'm a really big fan of all of your work. So today I'll be speaking to you about my project in Alaska, in which I'm working with an Alaska Native community to figure out the best ways that we can use digital approaches for mapping their landscape. So, hey, it works. My research, welcome to the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. This is where the Yukon and the Kuskokwim, two very large salmon rivers, flow into the Bering Sea. And for much of the year, like right now in November, it's covered in ice and snow. But for a very brief window in the summer, I'm just going to point, there we go. Brief window in the summer, it's a very lush tundra wetland, absolutely full of fish, game, and edible plants. Although this is an area more than quadruple the size of the Netherlands, it's home to only around 25,000 people, most of whom identify as Yupik, and they live here in a manner that's very similar to their ancestors. Prior to contact with Westerners, the Yupik lived a semi-sedentary lifestyle, so they would move throughout the landscape and living in skin tents, following the seasonal movements of fish, game, and berries throughout the year. However, in the colder months, they would shelter in the so-called winter villages. And these were massive, sometimes 20-meter large structures consisting of wood and earth walls and a superstructure of wood. Very warm, very cozy and comfortable. Also, they tell us. However, with the arrival of Western colonial influence, this would disrupt their ways of life completely. Social upheaval began with contact with Russian fur traders and Orthodox missionaries in the 19th century and continued well after Alaska was purchased by the US in 1867. Like elsewhere in the US, boarding schools were with mandatory attendance was set up, forcing Yupik families to abandon their mobile lifestyle and depopulating vast areas of the landscape. Missionary boarding schools were particularly bad, particularly complicit in preventing children from speaking their native language, relinquishing their customs, and just learning subsistence skills that they need to survive. But this is not a story of how a culture was destroyed, but how they have managed to rise above all of that adversity. After 2 centuries of having these ways of life suppressed, they have managed to hold on, and with the passage of legislation in the 20th century, granting them more territorial control, they've made a real concerted effort to reclaim their culture. They do this by carrying out inter-village tribal conferences, dance festivals, crafting workshops, to make sure that, and making really sure that their children learn the language, the Yupik language. And this is where our story begins. And it's in the spirit of cultural reclamation that in 2009, artifacts started washing up on the beach. And this was a sign to the people of Quinahuk that there was an ancestral village eroding into the sea. I should mention Quinahuk is a village of 700 people. Yupik customs normally dictates that such sites are left alone out of respect to the ancestors, but rather than prevent their children from, having the opportunity to learn more about their ancestors, village leadership chose to break with that convention by inviting archaeologists from the University of Aberdeen to excavate at the site. The Nuna Nalluituq site is a 17th century winter village that was burnt down in an attack by a neighboring tribe. And because of the permafrost, the preservation is absolutely wonderful. We've got entire masts and, I beg your pardon. Mask and artwork and subsistence tools like harpoon points being recovered. As you can see in the photos, the community was very much involved in the day-to-day running of the excavation. I'm really sorry, I'm going to close this window on the side
exactly.
and figure out.
It's minus, I think.
Yeah, the minus. Yes.
Put that up here. Yay. Oops, it's not liking me changing.
You have to click
Oh, yeah.
empty image.
Okay, that makes sense. Sorry about that. Okay. From the outset, the community-based approach employed by Aberdeen has allowed this project to shine. This is the wider project that I'm working with. And an entire generation of youth has grown up learning about how their ancestors lived in this harsh landscape. And now elders are, for the first time in many years, emboldened to tell their stories and oral histories. In 2014, the Yupik, the local children formed a dance group, and they performed the first Yupik dance in that region in 100 years. That was really, really cool. In 2019, Quinahap converted a school building to house 80,000 artifacts recovered from the site. And this is a fully equipped conservation lab now that we have set up there. But unfortunately, this newfound period of profound cultural reclamation is at risk. The YK Delta is a very fluvial landscape, a lot of soft fluvial deposits. So landscape change is very much part of the way of life and cosmology of the Yupik people. For example, there's an oral history that says a prophecy of sorts. The Quinahap will move 5 times. And this is supposedly a third location where it's moved since that prophecy was made. However, every successive year is the warmest ever in the Delta. And the extremely high rate of permafrost loss poses a real existential threat, not just to communities like Quinahap, but also their cultural sites. We're losing terrain much faster than they have ever prepared for in the past. This is very much the greatest source of anxiety to villages like this in Western Alaska. Oops. Which is where my research comes in. Rather than focusing on a single site, I am working with the community to develop new ways of surveying the cultural sites in the landscape in what can be very difficult to traverse terrain. You know, the weather is often really harsh and the ground is very soft and wet. And of course, there is uncooperative wildlife like bears and moose. I hate bears, just as an aside. So yeah, the pandemic was a real logistical nightmare for me, but I've managed to finally carry out 2 field seasons, including this summer, alongside my external supervisor, Sean Gleason. He's an external, he's an ethnographer based at Hampden Sydney College. So after much thinking, I have realized that there are actually just 2 components to my work. One is what techniques are the most useful for use in this environment, and secondly, how can capacity be built for communities like Quinahap to continue this work. This is really important to us. So in Quinahap, we are very fortunate to have a very strong foundational data set that we use to develop our techniques in the form of a traditional place name survey carried out by Joe Pleasant. He was an employee with the village corporation Connectuk. To create this list, he did interviews with elders and walked around the landscape recording places with his GPS, handheld GPS. And because of his hard work, we were able to put all of these sites into a GIS, around 150. And after 2 years of interviews with local elders, we have recorded around 80 more. Our favorite interview style is to have ArcGIS open on a laptop with a touch screen, and we record the screen and people can show us where stuff is, which is really useful. And there are dozens of these sites around Quinahap, ranging from abandoned villages, abandoned winter villages, and also traditional subsistence areas like hunting camps and fishing camps and berry picking spots. Yupik place names are really fascinating to me because they encode the use of the place in the name, like in many cultures. So, for example, here we have Mesatuya, place where we get fresh water. And this is also quite crucial place where the boats can barely get through. So people recalling these names know when to travel or when not, or where not to travel because it's dangerous. Oops, I'm just going to go back. Oh yeah, apologies. Yeah, and it's also quite notable that the reason the village commissioned this original study and the reason they are so supportive of my work is that they were trying to protect these place names from being erased by modern agencies. For example, here you have and I won't name this federal agency, but they've named this slough, the unnamed slough. And right there, right next to it, they've written down the Yupik place name as if, you know, it's not as important as the Western name. It's as an afterthought. Chupamikuiga means the place that where the ice breaks first. So it will be a source of fresh water in the colder months because we know the ice will always break here first. They can go there to drink. All these subsistence places on that list are precious to the community. Every single one, but I think the sites that contain the sod houses are the ones that people have the most emotional connection to, because these were more permanent structures that were used by their ancestors. Yeah, these were homes and places where their lives revolved around. Around 15 to 20 of the places on that list are known or implied to have sod houses. Sometimes many structures, sometimes just a single isolated structure. They also leave a very distinct imprint after they are abandoned. So I'm just going to press that button. Yeah. So they sort of cave in and it becomes kind of like a crater shape. So at least in theory, they should be very easy to spot. Here are other places in the YK Delta where there are sod houses. This is the 2,000-year-old Gifchahak site, and it's like craters on the moon. This is a more recent, I think 18th century Kashunak site, and this is the layout with large central houses and inat the side houses, and it has a very distinct shape. So I'm based in Quinahak, so I'm very interested whether there were sod houses in Quinahak. We know there were, based on the ethnography that we've done with people and archival photos as well. And even up to the 1970s, people were still utilizing these structures to live in, as I'll show you a really cool example later on. So with this in mind, this is what I was expecting to find in the Quinahak landscape. Instead, what I got was a bit less, a bit more subtle. For the most part, we don't get this cratering. This is the only place in Western Alaska where the sod houses don't crater in. Instead, they just collapse. However, it's really encouraging that there is a signature that we can, it's not ideal, there is a signature that we can look at, and that's the vegetation differences. Oops. Yeah, so I'm just highlighting the structures now. And yeah, very hard to see, but the vegetation differences are a bit of a giveaway that something is different in the terrain. So in the effort to quantify these vegetation changes, this is my very basic budget setup that I used in my first field season, 2021. I had essentially just glued a parrot sequoia 4-band multispectral camera to a secondhand Phantom 3 drone, which was really annoying to use because the flight time was only 10 minutes given the strong winds. So I was only able to get site scale surveys and nothing in the wider landscape. I should also address here why I'm choosing to use UAVs instead of multispectral satellite imagery. It's not just a matter of better resolution, high quality images. It's although that helps, it's also about data sovereignty. If the community was to continue the work that we are doing, it's very important they own the imagery and have a right to do whatever they want with it, as opposed to buying data from the satellite companies. As you know, they put a lot of restrictions on how these imageries can be used. So using my budget setup, I experimented with different false color composite combinations. These are the ones in this panel here. And it's very clear that the non-visible spectra of light is very useful for visually depicting the archaeology. Stacked composite is definitely an improvement on satellite and normal UAV imagery. I also use create vegetation indices for those of you who don't know what a vegetation index is. It's when where I subject every pixel in the image to an equation that's intended to highlight the vegetation change. This is a very common technique in agriculture, and now is increasingly being used in archaeology. NDVI is the most famous one, but I'm finding that CIG is easier to see the individual structures there. So this is something I have been, so visually the features can be delineated quite well, but I'm trying to see if it can be statistically defined. And there are some promising results, some early promising results. This is a multispectral image of the Uyakmute site. There are 4 slot structures. I'm just going to show the mouse for the audience at home. 4 slot structures here, 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 and here, and here. This is all sterile ground where there is no features. And there's something else here that's cultural. Can anyone spot it?
Pathways?
Yeah, the pathways were super good as well. I think this would be a separate paper for me just to do. It's important for people to know where the subsistence paths are for search and rescue and so on, and movement through the landscape. So that's I'm really glad that turned out well. There are also a collection of fish processing pits here where people would fillet all of the fish that they would catch in the river and leave them for further processing for drying. So if we examine the spectral values associated with these 3 clusters, we can start to see that there are some statistical differences. This PCA, so this is, I should mention, this is all one single species of grass, yet for each, we've got the sterile areas and the 2 different cultural signatures have very distinct values, so I'm quite happy with that. And it's clear that NDVI, which is the most common one used in archaeology, is not as useful as different alternative vegetation indices in this area. I've also experimented with using automated techniques for finding sites, and it works. It works on a landscape scale everywhere except my study area of Quinahuk. It works. I just found out last year that Alex Gerds marked my master's, and this was my master's project, looking at the vegetation signatures on Kodiak Island. And yeah, it worked perfectly well, but it doesn't work on a landscape scale in Quinahuk. You can ask Alex if you don't believe me, but yeah. And I think the reason for that is that the Quinahuk area is so biologically diverse. There are lots of different subbiomes in the area, and each subbiome where there is archaeology has a different signature. So I'm finding it very difficult to do pattern recognition, both supervised and unsupervised, on a large scale. I may have to constrict my analyses to, sub areas. How can automated processes be used for a certain area to find a certain type of archaeology? It's very tough, but this is a problem I'm working on now to see if I can get it to work. Does it work at a more local scale? Maybe. This is an unexcavated sod structure next to the main Nuna Nalluituq site. And we know it's a site because I spent 2 weeks in it in my undergraduate thesis, digging a hole. I would dig 5 centimeters every day because of the permafrost, and I couldn't dig deeper, and it kept filling up with water. So eventually I was able to recover some cultural material from that. So that's definitely a site, and it's covered with berries. That's how I found it in the first place. So using that in support vector machine supervised classification, we were able to see if it could, delineate the landscape and point out the archaeology. And to an extent it does it quite well, but I'm not happy with how many false positives there are all over the place. It marks berries where there are no berries. So back to the drawing board with that. I attempted to get more imagery of berries this year in 2022, but the weather has been so fluctuating so much that for the first time in many years, there were no berries that popped up in July. They appeared in August after I had left. So that's just showing you the scale of the ecological disruption that's happening now in Quinnahuck. So fast forward to this year, I was very thankful to Sean for getting more funding, because now we could upgrade our toys. Now we have a massive drone with good battery life. So I'm able to capture a large swathe of terrain that I'm still trying to analyze. Not only does it carry my parrot sequoia, but it also has a specialized photogrammetry camera. And this allows me to make 3D visualizations of the landscape that can be very useful for the work. As you see here, this is one of 2 sod houses where it's how I expect it to look, which is a sort of crater shape, and we're able to capture that signature, that nice C-shaped walls of the collapsed structure. So what does work really well in Quinnahuck is what I'm using a lot now is the fusion of different layers of data. So I use blend modes in ArcGIS Pro. You can also use it in Photoshop as well to blend the elevation data with multispectral composite images. And that has really worked wonders in making stuff pop out that I had not seen before. So for example, we are back at the Uyuk site again. You can't see any structures on the satellite imagery. This is very high resolution, 50 centimeter satellite imagery hosted online, but clear as day. If you overlay the elevation data, not just raw elevation data, but also hill shades or any other kind of relief visualization toolbox product with the multispectral imagery, it lets in most places, it lets the archaeology pop out really well. So I'm going to run with this, and I'm going to keep trying to refine this process. So everything that Sean and I have done in the last 2 years is solely because of that culture of sharing and cooperation that was set up by the University of Aberdeen. And these are the principles that Sean and I subscribe to moving forward. From now on, we want to make sure everything that we do is fully documented, and all the data should be stored in the village with people who have the means to protect it and pass it down to next generations. Eventually, with better internet, with the advent of satellite internet, we'd like to host a server on the site that the community has access to. We are also showing motivation that we want to build capacity. And finally, we have to do projects that actually matter to the community. And what matters to the community, these are the two big ones in my mind. And the first would be helping them do CRM work of native allotments. Native allotments are a form of private property in Alaska, but it has some very harsh restrictions put on it by the US government. Before you can do anything with them, before they can be sold or transferred, it requires an archaeologist to come in and do an evaluation. And because Quinhagak is so rural, it takes this can take forever, depriving someone of their livelihood or income. So it would be good if we could make a workflow that uses our techniques to address this, so that when the archaeologists do come in, we can present data to them and say, hey, this is where stuff is. We've already done the work for you. Can you please sign off for the transfer of this property? That's the hope. So this is an example of that. This is my favorite story. I call this the hunt for Sam Carter's fish camp. So we know from ethnographic accounts that this entire area here is known as Sam Carter's, just Sam Carter's, and we know that he was living here in a sod house in the 1970s. We have an account by an elder called John Smith, who says when he moved to Quinhagak as a young man to marry his wife, Sam Carter, who was a relative, got onto his dog sled. This is 8 kilometers south of Quinhagak. He rode his dog sled all the way up to the village, kicked down John's door and said, I'm watching you, you look after her. And he said it was so intimidating. It was like a scene from a movie. And for years, we've been trying to figure out where Sam Carter's camp was, because as you can see in this image, there's nothing. I've received many different accounts as to where his camp could be. Some people say up here, some people say here, most people say it's down here, but I've checked and it's not. So where could it be? This is when we can resort to the spy satellite imagery from 1976, specifically, I can't remember what's the name of this. Not hexagon, keyhole. Keyhole. So before 1976, do you see anything now that could be his camp?
The middle?
Yeah. Is it that thing?
Yes.
Oh yeah. That is almost certainly where he was living. And I've walked past this 100 times and not seen it. That's just the way the features are in this landscape. They degrade so quickly. And it's highly likely this is it, because I wish I had photos of it. There are some known, this image extends up to Quinhagak and we can see some similar structures there as well. So I think, yeah, that's it here. That's the UAV imagery, not so good. Here's just the raw composite, but here's what I've done that I mentioned earlier, where I overlay some elevation data, and you can start to see features really pop up. Like we've got rectangular depressions here, we've got mounds. I have seen that mound in the past, and I assumed it was a grave. It never occurred to me to go left and see these depressions. So thank you, drone. Yeah. So in the future, I would hope that for this purpose, a local community trained up in our techniques could employ ethnographic interviews and use the archival imagery, carry out the survey, and then use scripts for automating the process. That's what I would like to work on after my PhD, is to refine this workflow to make it as easy as possible to carry out. The other thing that's important to the community is documenting the erosion. So right now, the situation in the YK Delta is extremely dire. You know, in order to qualify for grants, they have to hire outside companies to come in and then record the erosion, which is so exorbitant. They charge hundreds of thousands of dollars for a day's work. So it's desirable that communities in the YK Delta can do something like this more easily in a scientifically robust way. I hope this plays. Sadly not, but if you can just imagine here, we made a beautiful 3D model of the entire village. This is the most basic kind of work that I envision. And because it has a real-time kinematic connection to a differential GPS, it's quite accurate. And the hope is that the village can make products like this every single year to demonstrate to agencies to apply for grants that, hey, our land is subsiding, or hey, our river is eroding. And a more sophisticated thing I want to try is the use of automated change detection to demonstrate how landscapes have moved or shifted. The concept of change detection is very well established in remote sensing, where we are looking at the change in pixel values between an old image and a newer image, based on whatever based on a range of values. So if I wanted to see how much the river has changed, I would look for a difference of for this specific area -4 to -3.3, right, for example. So this is the bane of my life, trying to automate all of this through scripts in ArcPy and ArcGIS Pro. And it's just, if I can get it to work, it will save so many steps for someone trying to replicate this work. Here's an example of it in action. This is Napakiak, which is not very far from Quinahak, about 100 kilometers to the north. And I'm going, this image is from 2017. Let's see Napakiak from 2021. So already you probably notice a bit of a shift in the coast. So what I did is I calculated a vegetation index for both images, because the ground has soil and the soil has vegetation. So I'm using vegetation as a proxy to see how much the land has changed. And when we run the change detection, oh my gosh, all of this has gone. So the hope, in my perfect world, the script that I write would be able to, it prompts you to draw in the lines where the change has happened, and then it reports how much it has changed. So Napakiak is in big trouble because it's lost 80 meters of its bank over 4 years. And if any one of you are experts in Python in ArcGIS Pro, please talk to me, because I want to automate this. I want to make this drawing in of the change more intuitive, like a user interface that pops up and say, draw in the area that you want to measure. So yeah, that's my idealized workflow for that. So this is really a symbol of how long we've been working in Quinahak, that the local community is now very interested in replicating our work and servicing the other communities in the area. Together, we have founded an organization called Nalluituq, where it's run by a local Quinahak local. Her name is Lynn Marie Church. She's got a business degree and she's really good at getting Sean and I to do stuff, keeping us on track. And the hope is that we can train up local people to do the work that we do. And we've already started, for example, here, showing for the local municipal authorities how much native allotments have been eroded by riverine change. So after my PhD, if that day ever comes, I would like to start focusing more on the capacity building, getting a grant to teach people how to do data collection first, which is the drones. That's easy as long as they have their Part 107 commercial license. We can automate these processes. And then the data processing, I'm going to make sure my scripts are good enough to process the data change. And finally, we're going to need software and equipment to teach them GIS and how to make their own analyses. So over this last year, we've been training up 2 new high school graduates. And I think Brian is now being sent by his mom and dad to a trade school where he will get his Part 107 drone license and also welding. And then he will hopefully be working with us very soon in the near future. So to summarize, vegetation differences, yes, they work for locating sites with cultural remains, but I'm yet to be convinced that a statistical or pattern recognition approach is viable for this area. But I'm sure it can be done. What I really like is the multiple overlapping data set approach. That seems to work really well for visualizing, visually identifying stuff. Yeah, and from now in the YK Delta, it's always good to be cognizant of what is best for the communities. Keep their priorities at the forefront of any work that we do. And if they so wish it, we must also always demonstrate a willingness to share and to learn and to teach so that they can carry out this work for themselves. And that's me, Kuyana. Thank you so much for listening and for having me.